Jordan, welcome to the podcast.
William, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, for our audience today, Jordan is a friend, but beyond that, he is extraordinarily accomplished. Besides being a first year student now at Harvard Business School, he is also doing a joint program with that at Yale Law School.
Yes.
Before that, between working for a few years, he also completed a master's at Oxford was the Rhodes Scholarship, and even before that was did his undergrad at Princeton University.
Yes.
So many degrees, Jordan.
You're telling me.
What matters ultimately to you?
I ultimately want to be a good person, and I want to live a life that creates value for individuals, and particularly for me, persons who come from marginalized communities and marginalized backgrounds. So that's really what energizes me, coming from Newark, New Jersey, and growing up as someone who just daily saw the struggles of being in an urban community like that and not having a lot of resources, not only in the community, but even just in my own family. Always felt really compelled to try to make a difference, and thankfully had a very strong influence from my father and my mother on education. And my dad was a teacher in the Newark Public School system and always just really preached to me the value of really investing in your studies and trying to improve yourself such that you can contribute to your own livelihood and your family's livelihood, but also to the advancement of others. And so that always just really stuck with me. And I think that a lot of how I've navigated my professional journey, my academic journey, is rooted in trying to understand how systems of power can be harnessed for a broader social good. And really, I think grappling with the complexity of attending very privileged institutions like Princeton, Oxford, under a Rhodes Scholarship, no less, which has its own sort of complicated history. And then now in this joint degree, JD MBA, Yale Law School, Harvard Business School, really understanding how these institutions perpetuate systems of harm, but also if utilized the right way and navigated the right way could hopefully try to contribute to a better future as well. So that's really been I'd say the through line across these 4 degrees. And there is a method to the madness.
Absolutely. Well, it seems like you're certainly a man on a mission.
Thank you.
So, you mentioned, and we can dive into so many pieces. So we'll take it one chunk at a time. And more specifically, you're in your first year at Harvard Business School. You mentioned that the biggest things about these privileged institutions is that they are often entrenched. It is very difficult to get into them, especially as someone who comes from a community without as much resources and with many societal barriers. What has been kind of your experience and perception, be it Harvard or Yale, kind of the mindset on campus that you feel is different and perhaps challenges your kind of experience from prior?
I would say that every institutional context is distinct. And so there are a lot of similarities between Yale and Harvard. There are also a lot of differences. Same goes for Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the professional focus of the schools that I happen to inhabit also make a difference. And so, I could wax poetic about how much I love the law, but also how frustrating it could be. And I could do the same for business. They're just tools of the trade, if you will, frameworks and ways of knowing, ways of operating that I think shape Yale Law School versus Harvard Business School, distinct from already the differences that you would notice just by nature of it being Yale versus Harvard, right? So I recognize that a lot. I think in this first year of study at Harvard Business School, it's been a constant bit of reflection on my part to try to understand what am I navigating that's truly institutional, like truly Yale versus Harvard, and what am I navigating that's just, I'm not a law student anymore, at least not on my day-to-day coursework. I am now in a business school context versus a legal context. And that, I think, has also been a healthy bit of reflection, because there are all sorts of ways in which we just do business differently than we do law, and conceive of business differently than we conceive of law. So I would say the biggest differences, if I were just to reduce it to the institutional context, is that Harvard has assembled a tremendous network of graduate schools that are brand powerhouses on their own right, right? And so you could mention Harvard Medical School, you could mention Harvard Law School, you could mention Harvard Business School, Harvard Dental School, all of these, Harvard Kennedy School, the government school, all of these are remarkable powerhouses in their own right. Yale, and then people sort of joke around about how the undergraduates here at Harvard are almost like afterthoughts. And I would say that Yale is distinct in what I think I really appreciated as a law student there, in that it has also a wonderful network, obviously, of top tier graduate schools, but a lot of its investment has gone into a mix of the undergraduates. And I would say the law school obviously has a certain brand recognition and a certain influence in the legal sphere that's well recognized. It prior to having shaken up the U.S. News World Report rankings, Yale Law School, dating back to the late 80s, early 90s, had every single year been ranked number one without fail. Right. And so that's a level of staying power and a level of influence that I think has allowed that institution to think very critically about what it wants to contribute to legal culture and to the legal profession and to society more broadly. And I would say that the current dean, Heather Gerken, there has been using that platform very intentionally. And she's been thinking about, if not Yale, which really has nothing to lose because we've been ranked number one since the very beginning, who in the legal industry and the sort of sphere of legal academia is going to make a big difference. So she's used that platform to invest very intentionally into scholarships for under-resourced attendees of Yale Law School, which I've been a big supporter of. I think it's really wonderful to make sure that if you want to attend Yale Law School, your finances should not be a barrier to you doing so. She's thought a lot about how she wants to recruit from underrepresented backgrounds and like make sure that you're going out into those communities and forming a pipeline of recruitment that helps them, as early as they start thinking about standardized testing and things like that. And so I would say that's a bit of a difference, right? Because if you're on the Yale side of things, I would say that they really try to blend that mix of, we're going to invest a lot in our undergraduates, but we also recognize there are a couple of our graduate schools that in particular are doing something very distinct. And so Harvard's like all the way on one side of the spectrum of, we're just like a crazy labyrinthine sort of conglomerate of powerhouse graduate schools. Yale says, well, we want to be something in between. We want to have an undergraduate focus, but obviously really invest into our particularly strong graduate programs. And then Princeton is just its own sort of lone wolf. We mostly focus on undergraduates here at Princeton, and we don't have a law school, we don't have a business school, we don't have a medical school, and so. But aside from Princeton's PhD programs and its master's programs, and obviously a very strong policy school at the formerly Woodrow Wilson School, now Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, Princeton's all about its undergraduate focus. So that shapes a lot of how you navigate those institutions. Yeah. But then, then we could go into the major similarity, right? So that's sort of ruffling feathers, nitpicking, like what makes them distinct. If I were pitching to a student who was interested in attending them, a high school senior, for instance, who's applying to them, I would sort of frame their distinctions as such. But then how are they similar? Well, they all have multi-billion-dollar endowments, and they all have very complicated histories of marginalization and systemic oppression that they have perpetuated at the same time that more recently they've tried to mitigate. And I think that you can't navigate those spaces without being very cognizant of that, right? Like I couldn't be a Princeton University student, and particularly a Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs major. I was a concentrator in that school without thinking of Woodrow Wilson's legacy, not only as obviously a president who did a lot of good to further American interests, but also was very clear in his strong views on anti-Blackness and segregation, and his very successful efforts to resegregate the military while he was in office. And so you constantly, I think, in these spaces need to grapple with that historical legacy and even modern stances that they might take on issues that you disagree with, and try to recognize ways that you could perhaps be an advocate for change and for some sort of impact within those ecosystems.
Absolutely. And there are so many points made, but let's focus a little bit on this education piece and more broadly in the U.S. social context. You mentioned that the dean of the law school put especially a lot of effort into reaching out to these marginalized communities, ensuring that our legal voices are more representative of what America is today. As a soon-to-be lawyer, no doubt you have thoughts on the Supreme Court decision last year that impacted, policies, especially for the educational institutions, but even more broadly, perhaps in the workplace, on diversity, equity, inclusion, however one frames it. Um, what were your thoughts on kind of the ramifications now, almost a year later, that it's had on the educational institutions in the United States, or if any?
Well, it's definitely had a significant impact, not just on educational institutions, but also private sector institutions. And I've had several conversations with individuals who are thinking about, how they navigate now getting ready to leave Harvard Business School and go out into the workforce, spaces that are not state entities, which is important, right? Because we think of the Constitution as applying a set of individual rights under the Bill of Rights and subsequent amendments that generally enforce state action, right? Mm-hmm. And so we don't apply the Equal Protection Clause to private entities. We apply the Equal Protection Clause to state action of sorts. And that in the law, without boring our listeners here, ends up being a very critical distinction around thinking about like, was this actually state action? And mm-hmm. how do you think about like government action in that right? But still, there are businesses that are thinking very critically about, what is our duty now in light of this recent opinion. We may not be state actors in a direct sense, but I think it gets very complicated, for instance, once you start seeing like quasi-private, quasi-public entities that are receiving like substantial state subsidies and substantial state funding. So they're almost acting as like agents of the state, even though they're doing what seems to be more privatized type work. And so then it gets very complicated thinking about where your obligations are under the opinion. I guess I should take a step back and just say, like, what was that Supreme Court opinion? So this is the Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard, and there was also a consolidated case, a related case that involved the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And it was all about the way that they structured their admissions program that seemed to favor certain minority applicants in ways, right? And there's a whole line of Supreme Court precedents that has thought about how universities can consciously take into account race as a plus factor, if you will, without necessarily having a quota. So the Supreme Court has been very clear in its historical case line on this, that quotas are not okay. You cannot simply say, if we're building a law program of 200 students, which is a pretty common sort of average number of students in many of the top law schools. Yale has 200, Stanford has, I think, 180, UChicago's in the same ballpark. So if you say we're building a cohort of 200 law students, you can't say, well, we're going to reserve 20 of those spots, 10% to African Americans. That would be a quota, and that's been deemed impermissible under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, because it says that, you should not deprive people of the equal protection of the laws. You shouldn't engage in some sort of racial discrimination, and quotas seem to be, even though, and this is a complicated history in the law that I think a lot has been written on and I find quite fascinating, like to the extent that you believe the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment and what we call the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, which came about in the Reconstruction period post-Civil War, really to think about how we remedy our constitutional order and structure our constitutional order to account for the injustices of slavery and racial oppression. It's kind of fascinating that this particular clause that's rooted in a philosophy, if you will, and a goal of racial advancement has now also been applied in contexts where policies are discriminating, but they're discriminating for what you might deem to be benign purposes, right? So it makes a lot of sense when we think about racial discrimination that's nefarious, like truly trying to engage in segregation of the races, like the Brown v. Board Education case from the 1950s that said, like, you can't have segregated school systems. It is actually unconstitutional and also unjust, unfair to have systems that say that Black students must go to this school and white students must go to that school. That's like nefarious, purposely segregative activity. It's a little interesting when you think about affirmative action, which is saying, well, we recognize that there are systems of exclusion that are baked into how we do recruiting in educational contexts and others. And so we want to remedy that by thinking about how we allow more diverse voices to come in, such that you might say, well, that's like perhaps like race-based calculus, but it's benign, if you will. It's like, it's actually an enhancing of sorts. And we still say that in certain contexts, that's impermissible. So we said that you can't do quotas. And we said that basically it needs to be a holistic plus factor. If you're going to consider race because you have all sorts of compelling interests in wanting a diverse community, right? So many studies that show that teams perform more effectively when you have a diverse range of voices. So many studies that show that academic, like intellectual dialogue is enhanced when you have a diverse range of perspectives. So yes, many entities have an interest in promoting diversity, but then the question for the Supreme Court becomes like, how can you do that permissibly without crossing the line into what seems to be just sort of blanket, like we need to meet a quota of sorts. And so the Supreme Court in its most recent opinion thought that Harvard and UNC were pushing the line a bit too much. It wasn't just a plus factor. They were probably putting way too much stake on race as a very strong weighing factor. And they said that, you could assess people's backgrounds such that you can, ask them in their personal statement to talk about struggles that they may have experienced, and they can volunteer that information, right? I can talk about my experience growing up as a Black person in the city of Newark, New Jersey, within our broader U.S. framework, and all the struggles that may have provided to me. But the structure of admissions applications cannot have these diversity statements that are very specifically attaching a whole bunch of weight simply to the fact that you're a minority, right? And so that complicates things on education's campuses. You see now that in this most recent admissions cycle, they've basically scrapped a lot of their diversity statements language that was heavily rooted on racial diversity or ethnic diversity, and they've now simply invited them to talk about hardships in their life and allowing students, if they want to, if race was a significant enough factor, to volunteer that, but they're no longer prodding it. That's a very interesting development, and some of the language is very clunky. I do a bit of admissions counseling and just like mentorship in that space, and you see some of these schools, I won't name any names, but you see some of these schools, and I think they're so caught up in the legalese of what they're allowed to encourage students to write about that some of these questions that they're posing are actually very difficult to get a sense of what they're asking students. But then you see it also, like, a more recent development on this is even just this week, I think it was on Friday, you had that same group, the Students for Fair Admissions group, that's now targeting how admissions is done at West Point Military Academy, because the Supreme Court opinion in the Harvard and the UNC cases were very clear that they were applying to a certain subset of institutions, but that military institutions were distinct because they had a distinct set of interests in why they might want a diverse military force, and they were very cognizant of that. And so they didn't want to really inhibit the military academies like West Point's ability to still do some sort of race-conscious admissions. And now that group, SFFA, is very upset about that, and they're very directly now targeting West Point's race-conscious admissions policy and basically forcing the Supreme Court's hand on further elaboration around whether or not West Point could do things the way it's doing. So, yeah, that's a very long-winded way of saying, like, absolutely, this is having an impact. It's fundamentally shaping how academic institutions are doing things. It's getting private sector actors very concerned about whether they can still do some of their race-conscious things that they've been at the forefront of. It raises all sorts of questions about DEI in the private sector. And we're going to see more Supreme Court activity on this, I think, very, very soon with this West Point case.
Definitely a lot for our audience to think about, especially as it pertains to this context. You mentioned earlier specifically, there are actions that various universities have taken, and I want to bring it back here to Harvard a little bit. It was the recent resignation of the university president, Claudia Gay, which was described as the shortest tenure for a university president, at least at the Ivy League in recent times. And, part of that was some ascribed to, race as a factor and kind of focusing on, especially scrutiny of her versus perhaps other university presidents. What are your thoughts on that and kind of like this very short, tenure and impact that has had?
Yeah, I think it's a terrible situation. I found it really heartbreaking to see how it all occurred as again a black student on Harvard's campus. I know that there was a lot of personal joy, but also a lot of community energy and fervor surrounding her inauguration in September. It was a wonderful celebration. There were bands playing, walking all around campus. There was just this huge jubilation that day. And it was really symbolic in a lot of ways as well, right? I believe she was the 30th president. And so just to have hit that very
Mm,
sort of wonderful even number, and to think about the legacy of Harvard over the past 400 years, and to now have arrived at this point, I think that there was a lot of excitement around what the future held, and to see it unravel so quickly the way that it did, I think was really devastating for a lot of us on campus. I was a big supporter of hers from the very beginning, and in many ways, I still think that there are reasons to criticize, while at the same time lamenting how the process was carried out. And so again, I'm a person trained in the law. And so there are just certain things that we value in how procedures are carried out. And we talk a lot about due process. And I just think that you look at comparable instances. Stanford had its own academic integrity scandal at the highest level of its administration very recently, too. And that was a process that took multiple months of investigating and multiple months of clarifying, cross checking, like really doing due diligence and making sure that before any action was taken against this administrator, there was a proper process that we could really lean our hats on and say, okay, we now have the full set of evaluations in front of us to make an informed decision. And we can
hmm
say that there was no way that, or let me say, there was significantly less of a chance that we might have done wrong by this individual. And I just think that every person, especially at such a high level of duty, really deserves that, right? And so that's what I think what troubled me the most about this is that you sort of follow the sequence of events on what took place, and it seemed to unravel extremely quickly. There were allegations that came forth. The Harvard Corporation comes out and expresses solidarity with Claudine Gay on, I think, Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, and then or maybe the week before then. And then I don't know what materially changed, but it seemed like very quickly after that, pretty much from out of the blue for most of us, you're then getting this resignation email. And so, this process behind what happened, I think, troubles me. Like you said, some of the differences in treatment, perhaps, of Claudine Gay versus the other university presidents is troubling. I will say on that regard, this is why this whole situation is complicated, right? Because we know that Claudine Gay wasn't the first to go. We know that the president out of the University of Pennsylvania was the first to go, and I will very, I think, appropriately acknowledge, like, she was not African American, right? And I think that she faced a lot of criticism and a lot of political pressure and donor pressure similar to what Claudine Gay received. And so, I would be naive and just unfair and unfairly narrow in my assessment of the situation to say, well, it was just because Claudine Gay was black. Like, absolutely
Right.
not. I would also be naive to history and to modern systems of systemic oppression and systemic institutional implicit biases if I didn't acknowledge that surely her blackness played a role in particular comments that were levied against her. I mean, I saw way too many N-words floating around, formerly Twitter, now X, to be comfortable with myself. And so I think it's a very complicated situation. Honestly, we can talk a whole hour about there
Right.
were ways that procedures, I think, could have been sharpened, could have been more transparent. There were also ways in which this was an issue far greater than Claudine Gay.
hmm
This was, I think we see the same sort of remnants of a movement now being levied against the MIT president who was on that same panel of three. And
hmm
again, Jewish herself, not African American. So it's bigger than race, but there were a lot of racial undertones that fueled particular comments and commentary around Claudine Gay that I find very troubling. And I just don't think there's any place in 2024 for people to be discussing the circumstances of a highly accomplished, highly intelligent university president who happens to be black and levying, racial epithets of the sort that I saw. That is racist. We can talk about how what happened to her is beyond just racism, but there was a lot of racism underlying things that were said about her and particular actions that were taken against her. And so it's a very complicated situation that can't be reduced to a single issue.
Absolutely. And speaking of this broader conversation on race, in this space that there's been race, and even here in Boston, there's been conversations, whether it's in the government or in the private sector, and especially on school campuses, where a lot of the arguments on one side have been especially critical of the diversity efforts. They mention obviously the Supreme Court case, but they also give examples of the sort of self-segregation that happens among both the student body and in certain cases in the public sphere as well, where you have obviously the historically Black colleges, which were only possible because those students were not afforded the same opportunities within the wider university system. But now there are, for example, spaces specifically for minority communities on campus, whether it's dorms or specific places. And a lot of critics in the space say, like, why wasn't that afforded to non-minorities? Or even more publicly, for the Boston mayor over the holiday season, Christmas season, there was a holiday party for the minority members elected. And, there was a lot of uproar about that because, had on the other side would have been for a group of white legislators. So it's like, we will have a non-minority party. That would have certainly have caused a social uproar. What are your kind of thoughts on kind of like what spaces are allowed or should be allowed or encouraged in that space, kind of like having your own community and identity within the complexities of modern times?
So I think it's extremely challenging, and it goes back to some of what I was referencing in my discussion around the evolution of equal protection doctrine and how we think about race as a legal matter and policies that implicate race as a legal matter, right? So I mentioned that at its core, in the very early days when racial discrimination was like so prevalent and so clearly nefarious and so clearly malintentioned, that at its most basic level, what we were trying to do with a lot of how we thought about race in America was to just eliminate those nefarious harms and those nefarious actors that were inflicting real racially targeted harm on people. And I'd say that then gets more complicated as how we structure our policies, how we think about just general interpersonal interactions. People become a lot more racially conscious, become a lot more racially accepting. That starts to evolve, and we actually start to think about policies that are benign in how they are race conscious. We're no longer taking race into account for the purposes of segregating or targeting or inflicting harm. We're actually taking race into account, we believe, for the purposes of helping to remedy systemic barriers to access, systemic barriers to justice. We're thinking about how we remedy all sorts of inequalities now that are deeply entrenched. And it's very difficult to do that without thinking consciously about race. You can't say, well, there are all sorts of racial harms and racial imbalances that still exist, and by the way, we're going to try to fix those by not thinking about race. That would be like saying, we're going to go out and we're going to try to, there's all sorts of ways in which trucks aren't quite riding the right way. We think that like the way that we've like built into the factories, like the construction of our vehicles seems to somehow just like put less engine power into the trucks, and then say, well, how do you think about that? Well, I'll tell you one thing: go into the factory and don't look at the vehicle production with an eye toward the trucks. Like go into the vehicle production, just look at every vehicle holistically, like take every vehicle on its own terms, and just like take a vehicle as a vehicle as a vehicle. Where it's like, well, you told me that there's something like deeply entrenched, like that we need to really look under the hood and figure out, because it's systemically happening to the trucks in our production process. So shouldn't I kind of take the trucks aside and like take a look at like what I can do to work on the trucks specifically, because the trucks are the ones that seem to be having this recurring pattern of engine failure. It's like, no, don't look at the truck specifically. Look at all the vehicles, all right? When you look at all the vehicles. And so, obviously I'm being facetious. Like, it's way more complicated than that. Humans are not vehicles. Production processes are not like social institutions and political institutions. But my point is, if you have a problem that you see to be a recurring pattern of disadvantage, if you will, occurring within a certain category of person, you would think that the best way to remedy that might be to be conscious of what is affecting that category of person, not to look like broadly across the range and say, well, we can't do anything that specifically helps you. Like we can't put oil in the like truck's engine. We got to put, we got to think about all the vehicles. Well, it's like, well, if oil in the truck's engine specifically is what needs to happen, like why wouldn't we do that? So I just think it's a very complicated issue, and you see it happening now when people talk about DEI. It's like an evolution of how we think about things. There was a time when DEI came onto the scene, and the idea there was, well, there are a lot of blind spots that we have in how we think about race in the modern era. Again, recognizing that a lot of progress has been done. Like this is not 1924, this is 2024, and how structures of inequality appear look way different. Like I have the benefit now, thanks to a century worth of advocacy and activism and policy change and social perceptual awareness on this, not worrying that like somebody from the KKK is going to come and try to lynch me, thankfully, right? So racism looks different, but that doesn't mean that there aren't still ways in which remnants of that legacy and just other legacies of racism are still present. And we talk about that a lot in like the police brutality context, and what's the disproportionate rate of police brutality on certain categories of Americans versus others, right? And so I think that what we're trying to do in the modern era, and it's very complicated, is grapple with a phenomenon in which many people, I truly believe this, are not outwardly racist, and there are many actions and policies that are not outwardly, manifestly racist in the way that they were a century ago, or even 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Yet there are still all sorts of ways in which there are inequalities and imbalances in place that we need to affect. And I think that some people get very weary of policies that are still taking race into account, like DEI initiatives or like critical race theory education, because they say, hey, like we're beyond that. Like we're not racist anymore. Okay. The KKK, for the most part, is not out there doing what it was doing a century ago, nor do we have like explicit sort of pre-1960s era levels, like state-sponsored segregation, right? And I think that people look at that and say, well, I'm not openly racist, so why do I need to learn about the history of slavery? Or, you're teaching my children that they're racist. And it's complicated because actually there was a time where the idea was that we needed to speak openly about these issues. And it was a process of like speaking openly about these systems of inequality and these structures of these legacies, if you will, of that dark past that allowed us to reach a point where so many people can say quite confidently, oh yeah, I'm not racist. Well, it's like, how did you get there? Well, it's like you grew up in this ecosystem of education and information and awareness and consciousness. And it almost feels like we're going backwards because now it's like, we've got this umbrella that's been working really well and we're dry. We're not being rained on so much anymore because these policies, I would argue, have actually been doing a pretty good job. And people say, well, now the narrative changes, and they say, it's almost like saying, well, actually, it's a fact that I'm holding this umbrella up, that's like, we're getting really wet because of the umbrella. And it's like, no, it's like, imagine how wet you would be without the umbrella. Like the umbrella is actually doing a pretty good job of keeping you from getting like downpoured on, and you want to take the umbrella away because you're almost arguing that it's like these policies that are really helping to remedy that are causing divisions. And I would argue that that's just not the case. I think that like there's a causal chain sort of misallocation there that's very challenging. People want to say, oh, DEI is the thing that's dividing us. Oh, critical race theory education is the thing that's dividing us. Like all of these, we're not racist. You're trying to make us racist. And I would say, well, you're not racist because you've grown up in an ecosystem of policies and institutions and like perceptions that have thankfully contributed a lot of policy over the last 50, 60, 100 years. But I worry that the more that we start scaling that stuff back, we're just going to go backwards on this. So it's very concerning.
There's definitely a lot of thoughts, a lot of things for people to think about there. You mentioned, of course, all of these things that have happened here in the United States and these impacts that as we talk about on school campuses. A significant, big part of your educational experience was the Rhodes Scholarship across the pond. And I wanted to kind of bring our audience in on a little bit of your unique experience. I believe you are the first Rhodes Scholars to come out of the Newark Public School system. Is that correct?
That is true.
I do know a certain young senator that grew up in Newark who also participated.
Cory Booker.
Certainly. Taking well after him, I'm sure. But what was your experience like, kind of, with the Rhodes experience and, Rhodes has changed over the years, and what was it like to be an African American? Was your experiences to participate in that program? Was the U.S. delegation of around 32 scholars back in 2018, I believe?
2018, yeah.
What was that? Yeah, what is kind of like for our audience? What was the Rhodes experience?
Oh, it was life changing, truly. So the Rhodes Scholarship, for context, is a scholarship to study at the University of Oxford, full tuition paid, and some living expenses. They'll give you a stipend that will cover your food and your housing, etc. And so it really is just a wonderful opportunity to immerse yourself in other cultures. There are 32 American Rhodes Scholars because there are various constituencies. So 32 American Rhodes Scholars every year, but
Hmm.
then about 100 selected across the globe. And so it's not just your cohort of 32 from the US
Right.
that you'll get to know very well, but also scholars that are being selected from China,
Hmm.
from Zambia, from Pakistan, from India, from Australia, from South Africa. And you really feel like you're a part of this network of individuals who are really aligned with that mission of the Rhodes Scholarship, which is to quote fight the world's fight, and that's really what bonds you. It's an academic it's an academic scholarship in the sense that you are rewarded for your academic performance in undergrad, but it's really a holistic evaluation when they're selecting those 32 in the US. They look not only at your academics, but also at what type of leader you are and your passion for making the world a better place and for quote fighting the world's fight. And that's a wonderful mission to really just take a cohort of exceptional people with the drive to try to contribute in some sort of meaningful way, because it
Hmm.
means that they're not looking for a particular category of person, right?
Hmm.
So everybody has a different definition of what it means to fight the world's fight. I'm somebody who's done so in many ways through systems of law and policy, and now thinking about the role of the private sector in that as well through business. But you can have somebody who, in my very same class of 2018 Rhodes Scholars, is interested in fighting the world's fight through being an academic and through shaping intellectual discourse that then ultimately contributes to policy narratives. You can have somebody who's fighting the world's fight through doing like groundbreaking cancer research. You can have somebody, and those people will end up doing like MD PhDs. And so everybody just has a different vision. You can also have somebody who's fighting the world's fight in very local ways. They're going back to their city and they're serving, sometimes not even in a public way, but they're doing really great nonprofit work, or somebody who's fighting the world's fight by being a pastor. And so I just think that it's an unparalleled network of individuals who are really united by that common goal of applying our passion and our energy and thinking critically about what spaces we want to inhabit and what opportunities we want to pursue, and then what opportunities we want to create and value we want to create for other people in the world to try to fight whatever the worst plagues of our global ecosystem we think are worth tackling. And so really learned a lot from just being around so many wonderful people like that. I think that the support that we have for each other and the genuine love that we have for each other in this network is really remarkable. It didn't matter when we were there what you said that you wanted to do in the future. There was this unabashed level of support and true belief that you could accomplish that. And so if somebody from Australia said they wanted to go be the prime minister of Australia, you said, absolutely, you go do that. You are going to do that. And I want to support you 100%. Why? I mean, partly because we had a former prime minister of Australia who was a Rhodes Scholar. So you had tangible evidence of feasibility, but
Right.
also because we just believe that, you can do whatever you set your mind to. And there was a real, I think, power that came from having now decades of alums who also contributed as mentors
Yeah.
and were willing to take us under their wing and try to shape how we navigated spaces as well. And so it's just wonderful to be part of a community that loving and that passionate about so many different things that you're just constantly learning from them, but you're also growing as a person because they're really encouraging you to follow your dreams and also questioning you too. I think we had very healthy debate around what we valued in the world, like what, right? And with your one precious life, as we say here at Harvard Business School, what will you do with your one precious life?
Right.
There's everything is finite. Your time is a precious resource that's finite, and you have to think about where you're investing it. And so we thought a lot about, okay, well, this is what you're saying you're valuing. This is how you're saying you want to fight the world's fight. But are those things that those values that underlie that mission that you've crafted for yourself, are they really worth
Mm-hmm.
valuing? Are there biases, institutional biases, maybe even national biases, right? Like I found so many times when I was thinking about international issues, the ways that my American perspective shaped a lot of my positions on these issues relative to somebody, for instance, from the UAE, or relative to somebody from Pakistan. And it was very helpful to have those conversations with them, because they would say, well, can you think about how you're taking a very sort of American centric lens to this? And it's like, you're absolutely right. And so I think we constantly questioned each other and we challenged each other in really powerful, very valuable developmental ways. And I grew so much as a person coming out of that. I grew as a leader coming out of that. And I think a lot of what I want to do in the future is influenced daily by experiences that I had there and conversations, and just this belief again that people out there who have come through that scholarship have done phenomenal things with, in many cases, very little resources early
Mm-hmm.
on in life, like me and many others. And so why not us? Why can't we set our mind to trying to accomplish some really big things out there, and not use our one precious life on something that is, I think that there are many things that are meaningful. So I don't want to say doing something that's meaningless. I don't think that really that exists. But on the spectrum of meaning,
Mm-hmm.
from like little bit to a lot, how do you think very actively about really trying to do something spectacular?
Absolutely. Now, Rhodes, as you mentioned, it's been decades. It's been set over a century long, I
Yeah.
believe. Um, and at the same time, in our modern times, we're struggling with still institutional barriers, inequalities, and historical legacies of individuals whose legacies have been extremely impactful but complex. The Rhodes Scholars is very much rooted in that respects, with Cecil Rhodes being, a on the forefront of course, at that point in time, uh, the British Empire and imperialism, and the complicated legacy he leaves behind is he did found this very prestigious, very impactful scholarship, and whose alumni have gone on to lead nations, led international nonprofit organizations, corporations, all walks of life. Um, in your time there, or from your thoughts, you know, how can such a program, and there are others like it out there in the world too, where, as you mentioned, the Woodrow Wilson School previously at Princeton is now just the Princeton School of International Affairs.
Yeah.
Um, what are your thoughts on kind of what is that struggle for the Rhodes alumni or Rhodes scholars in terms of that legacy here at Harvard? I know there were conversations about the renaming of certain houses for the undergraduate college because of the historic legacy of slavery and those who owned slaves, that impacted the university here.
I think that I'll start with the Rhodes context. And so,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, Cecil Rhodes, the founder of the Rhodes Scholarship, the Rhodes Trust, his endowment is really what allowed the scholarship. And then also written into his will, he has all sorts of stipulations, or at least at the time had all sorts of stipulations on what he envisioned the Rhodes Scholarship being. He was a fierce diamond magnate and a fierce imperialist who, I mean, really, you need no more evidence of that than to see that he had an entire country named in his honor at the time, if you
Rhodesia.
will, Rhodesia, now present day Zimbabwe. And so, I mean, he is a historical embodiment of that era of greed and wealth building and imperialism and land taking and land pillaging, that I think still has all sorts of modern day remnants of inequality shaped back to that era of colonialism and imperialism. And so you can't excuse the actions that he took and the real harm that he inflicted upon communities that again are still feeling the remnants of that. I would say what the Rhodes Scholarship has done a phenomenal job of is trying to recognize that this is not Cecil Rhodes Scholarship.
Mm.
Right? It's not the one that it's in many ways trying to preserve the virtues of what he believed that this could be, because the mission ultimately of trying to build a network of leaders who are fighting the world's fight and using immersive experiences at a world-class institution like University of Oxford to acquire a set of sensibilities and skill sets that will change the world for the better, hopefully, that is worth preserving. But there are also all sorts of colonial, racist, exclusionary views of what he thought it might be that we now eschew and we repudiate because we should. And we should think about how to create a more capacious, inclusive vision of the Rhodes Scholarship that builds a network in line with his mission of fighting the world's fight, but does so in ways that welcome a diverse range of perspectives, of backgrounds, and people from all sorts of parts of the world that weren't recognized at the founding of the scholarship. And so we actually continue to expand the Rhodes Scholarship. Mm-hmm. It's been an active conversation around what constituencies we want to welcome in. So I mentioned we have the US, I mentioned we have Pakistan, we have India, and there's constant discussion around what other constituencies aren't currently represented that should be. A few years ago, there was a major development that opened up. It's essentially an unrestricted placement in the Rhodes Scholarship class. It's just a global position. And so you can apply from anywhere in the world and be a global Rhodes Scholar versus being tied to one of your constituencies. And I think that was wonderful for recognizing more equity in the scholarship. And there's, we just celebrated actually 100 years of the Rhodes Scholarship this summer. It was a huge celebration back at the University of Oxford. So many alums came to speak. Former President Bill Clinton was there and gave the keynote address. And you could tell that there was a lot of really exciting conversation happening around how we continue to recognize that troubled legacy of Cecil Rhodes and actively discuss it. I mean, there are, plaques and other historical awareness raising items now all present around Rhodes House at Oxford, where you can really study the difficult elements of his legacy, while at the same time that we repudiate that, moving forward to a more capacious and just all around just and fair vision of the future, and continue to build a network that, if it's going to fight the world's fight, is doing so with the most deserving, the most meritorious, and also representative of the globe that we're fighting on behalf of set of scholars. So I'm very excited about that. And then I would say on the broader movement that we see around like how we think about legacies like Rhodes, you mentioned the Woodrow Wilson context at Princeton. It also happened at Yale. There was a dormitory there that was Calhoun College. Right. And so there's been a lot of conversation around this. And those of us who are listening or watching from Harvard Business School know that just last week we covered a case on the Dutch East India Company and how the Netherlands thinks about some of their historical figures from the time of the discoveries, when they were going out and engaging in state-sponsored, private oriented, like colonialism, basically. And a lot of those people, like the Netherlands would not be what it is today if it weren't for those people going out and engaging in the expeditions that they did. And I'm actually mixed African-American and Portuguese, and we think about the same thing in Portugal. Like Portugal of today obviously would not be what it is without all of its colonial ventures and like terrible atrocities that it committed in the slave trade, for instance. And I think that it's a constant process of trying to grapple with gratitude, if you will, for circumstances of wealth and just like economic prosperity that you enjoy today, right? At the same time that you say, but I 100% condemn the historical circumstances that made this possible, right? And I think that that's a very complex, nuanced position to hold, but I don't think that it's mutually exclusive. I don't think that it's contradictory to, at the same time that, and I say this as American, is like, I can 100% say I'm very grateful for the privileges that I enjoy as an American, and for all sorts of ways that we talk about, especially as the geopolitical landscape starts to shift and we start to see growing tensions with nations like China, that I benefit from America's position in the world. Full stop. That's true. But I can also criticize many actions that America has taken in the past and continues to take in the modern era that make some of that possible, right? And I think that it's important to constantly grapple with that. And that's how I think about the decision to honor historical figures, or the decision now to, perhaps take down statues, is like, first just start off with full set of facts. What is it that defines their life that we at one point thought was worth encapsulating in a statue? And then the question is, how is it that that's still compatible with virtues that we deem worthy of glorifying by statute recognition? And how is that incompatible? How have we shifted our views of morality and justice and fairness and law
Yeah.
such that maybe we don't think that's worth recognizing as statute anymore? And then I think the question is, first it's sort of a values question. And also, I think it is worthwhile to ask, how are they perceived by their historical peers, right? Because maybe nobody was talking about the fact that what they were doing was wrong. But maybe, like you see this especially in people who were slave traders, there was a very active abolitionist movement at the time, and all sorts of people who were saying at the time that they were actively engaging in the slave trade, like, this is wrong, you have to stop this, right? And so I think it's worth seeing how they were evaluated by their peers, and when we think about like how what they did might still be compatible with virtue, how it might be incompatible. And then I think it's important to ask ourselves, like, what's the proper platform, right? There's, to me personally, something very supportive, something very endorsing of a statue. I think that you're sort of physically propping this person up on a public sphere that to me just seems like it's serving a glorifying purpose that I think is distinct from like a museum. So if you're saying, well, we don't want to erase history, and that's what concerns us about taking statues down, well, then I think the question is, perhaps we don't take the statue down and, break it and throw it in the trash, but perhaps there's a museum of sorts where we can have a more complicated and thorough discussion around these troubled legacies without continuing to preserve them, like physically, literally in a space that seems to serve some sort of glorifying honorific purpose. So I think it's a very complicated issue. I think it's one that really requires a lot of discussion, requires a lot of community engagement too. I think that people should be, very actively empowered to share their views on this. But I do think that values change over time. And I think that it's not a disservice to history, I truly believe, to say that the values that perhaps at one time seemed to be acceptable and worthy of a statue have changed. We've grown as a society. We've learned things. We understand that that's no longer what we want to endorse. We no longer want to condone that, such that we don't think it's worthy of a statue. But obviously, there's a huge place for all sorts of other information awareness, information sharing places where that person's history can still be preserved. And so I'm not saying erase history. I'm just saying let's think about what platforms we're using and whether those seem to be serving an honorific purpose that are just incompatible with our modern values.
Absolutely. I think every time you speak, there is such great analysis and breakdowns of the complexities of the issue. You mentioned briefly the Rhodes Scholarship, just celebrated its 100th year. Again, we're at this great institution here at Harvard Business School. You did Rhodes, you're at Yale. I did the Schwarzman Scholarship, which was founded in the last decade by one of the wealthiest men in modern times and one of the most influential, Steve Schwarzman. As you mentioned, Bill Clinton was there to give the commemoration or celebration of the 100th year. And from these programs, from these institutions, often it often is correlated with producing world leaders, some very powerful individuals in society. And there's this conversation in the social media space, and certainly those that are highly skeptical of these institutions that produce these elites, or view these institutions that produce this elite with nefarious intent, as Illuminati or as kind of, this hidden cabal of individuals that, will control the world. What are your kind of takes on that as somebody who doesn't come from a very privileged background, right? Doesn't come from a background of elites, families and wealth. And certainly there are those that do come from those backgrounds and still achieve those successes because of those successes, right? But what are your kind of insights on kind of like the skepticism from a significant portion of the population, especially in the United States, but also globally, of individuals who, are very concerned about these elite institutions and elite traditions and and the products of those individuals?
I would say it's healthy and in some cases warranted skepticism, truly. I think that a lot of these elite institutions have had a disproportionate impact on how we think about issues, on then the individuals who are power brokers within structures of society and
Hmm.
especially in politics. Just look down the list of senators and look at their undergraduate or graduate education. And I would not be shocked to see a disproportionate representation of Harvard grads on there. And so then Harvard has to think very critically about what its obligation is to society, considering that it's placing a lot of individuals in the highest levels of power. And that's not even just true of the US context, but I would wager that there is an overrepresentation of Harvard grads in various sectors of work globally, right? Many people come as international students even to study at Harvard and then to go back to their home context. And you see that also of Oxford. Many students will study at Oxford. It's an intensely global institution and then go back to their home countries. And so that creates real, if you just think about it as a philosophical matter, obligations on the part of these institutions to think about what affects their education are what effects their education is then having on the societies that these people will return to and be productive professional members of. I would say beyond that need for accountability and skepticism, I do worry that we're reaching a place where it's almost like we have this fake news misconception of what's actually happening at these institutions, right? So it's one thing to say Harvard is educating a very large proportion of individuals who are extremely talented and extremely motivated, such that there's a correlation with then positions of power that they hold in the future, and recognizing that they're attracting this category of person that will go on to do really important things in the future. Harvard has to constantly think about what education it's imparting. That's one thing. It's a very sort of, I think, just like democratic theory, academic accountability way of framing it. It's another thing to say that like it's the Illuminati, of like
Right.
academic institutions, that there's some sort of, very strange, like almost illegal, illicit activity that's happening behind closed doors, and people are meeting with like hoods on their heads and stuff. And I don't really know. The undergrads, they have these weird clubs that they do, but I don't really think that people are like meeting, with Illuminati type,
Right.
like networks of influence and power. So I want to encourage like continued dialogue around not just what Harvard and Oxford and Princeton and all of these like historically elite institutions are doing, but just generally like what our systems of higher education are doing and what educations they're imparting, considering that these are in many cases pipelines of opportunity, and now in a increasingly competitive labor market, almost like de facto requirements for certain sectors of work. I
Hmm.
want to continue thinking critically about what educations we're imparting, and if we're really arming people with the right frameworks of thinking and skill sets of like technical capabilities that they possess to continue to create thriving ecosystems of work, thriving ecosystems of policy change to the extent that they want to get involved in the public sector,
Hmm.
and thriving ecosystems of just like support and community building. Right? I would love for us to think critically, continue having intense conversations about DEI. I encourage that because I want us to also think about, if it's not DEI, what
Mm.
is it that just allows us to come together as a community? And I think like that to me just matters so much more than starting to bicker and nitpick over what do you call it, what exactly does it look like, like to what extent can you include this or that. I think those are really helpful conversations, but I think that sometimes we almost get triggered by like certain buzzwords that we use like DEI, and we shut down. And it's like, okay, well, let's not call it that. Call it whatever you want. I don't care. But what I'm thinking about is what is a set of like policies and knowledge bases that we're sharing in these pipelines, academic pipelines, that ensure that when people go out into the world and actually need to coexist, that
Mhm.
there's a rich sense of community and integration rather than just bitter hostility and polarization, which is what we continue to see year after year. So I think there's a lot of healthy scrutiny right now around what elite institutions are doing. And again, very well deserved. They've had an outsized influence on every sector of American life and global life. But I want to think even more broadly about, not just what these elite institutions are doing, but what every institution of higher academic learning is doing. And again, we are here at Harvard Business School. I want to think really critically about what the private sector is doing. There are trillions of dollars captured up in the private sector. And I think we all have an obligation in the modern context to think about, again, how we're creating rich ecosystems that allow us to thrive and come together for some sort of broader good, public good, rather than, just leading to more disruption and harm and bitter divisiveness.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of taking beyond, the experiences here at Harvard and other institutions, uh, what about for yourself personally, Jordan? You're about to finish up in 2 years' time, I believe, roughly
Yeah, a year and a
2026.
half. Don't
Year
don't
and a half.
add, don't add too
Year and a
much
half.
later
Year
than
and a half. True, true, true.
that.
Right. Next year it'll be half, half here and there
Yeah.
at Yale. Um, what for you do you take away from, especially this joint degree, that you think was so vital to pursue them to impact the changes that you personally, as we discussed at the beginning of this episode, wants to impact?
I've learned through this experience that there is there are many languages that people speak that shape how they navigate professional spaces. And I don't mean that in the traditional sense of, I might speak English, somebody might speak Spanish, somebody else might speak, Portuguese. I mean that in the sense of there is a language of business, there
Mm-hmm.
is a language of law, there is a language of policy. And the more that I become exposed to these languages, I realize all sorts of wonderful connections that I didn't before, right? It's like somebody who studies English and then studies other Romance languages, and they see like, oh wow, there are all sorts of wonderful connections here that I didn't even recognize before. And they start to see all sorts of cool ways in which those languages influence each other and
Mm.
that they can use them for different purposes. And I think that's been in many ways the most empowering element of doing this dual degree is the more that I become well versed in the language of the law and the tools and trades that are affiliated with it, and then now continue to become more exposed to the language of business and the tools and trades affiliated with it, I gain a more expansive and exciting view of the ways that I can try to effectuate impact and try to contribute to a broader public good. As I mentioned, that's what drives me every day. I just want to be a good person in the future, and I want to take on causes that create value and really contribute to some sort of broader public social good. And so I'm less tied to it needs to look like this or that, and more tied to I'll know it when I see it. How can I be most helpful? And I will live a life, I think, of deep joy and satisfaction from just trying to be helpful to people and pouring my heart and soul into that as an objective. So I learned that there's different languages, and just like when you learn a new language like Spanish or like French, a whole realm of possibilities opens up to you. I've seen that through these dual degrees. And then the other thing I've seen that's in some ways even more important, and it's why I continue to feel like my mission is just to be helpful and to be a servant of sorts and to pour my heart and soul into other people, is I've constantly seen that no matter what language they speak, no matter what space they're inhabiting, whether they're a business person, whether they're a law person, they're a policy person, they're an academic, they just want to be held up in the books, I don't care. I've learned that people are absolutely remarkable. And there is a real energy here at the business school, just like there was a real energy at the law school, that just makes you feel so inspired daily by what people are doing and how phenomenal they are and how complicated they are. I mean, just what we navigate on a day to day as human beings in this world that can seem so unforgiving and so cold sometimes and so inexplicable. Like you just don't understand why things are happening the way that they are in your personal life. Family members that grow ill and pass away, friends of yours that tragedies happen to, or on a global scale. Why are these wars happening? It's like, and it frustrates you, and you get so passionate about these things. Everybody's navigating just complex, hard lives, and they're still finding a way to process that and exist in space as their own unique person. Like everybody is a one of one. And so I just gain immense amounts of joy and energy from just like meeting new people on these campuses and seeing like what makes you tick. Why are you here? Why are you doing whatever it is you think you're doing, and why do you want to do what you say you want to do once you're out of here? Like that's remarkable. And that to me, I just get so inspired every single day being in these spaces, and it's just not restricted to these spaces, but it's the same thing is true like when I'm back home in Newark. I've found that just fundamentally love people, and it's this constant process of meeting people and seeing how remarkable they are and how unique every single person is in the journeys and the narratives and the struggles that they inhabit, and somehow day by day by day continue to carry with them and just try to make sense of this crazy world that we're in is really inspiring. And I think that the more that I lean into that, and I'm just like, people can be inherently frustrating. People can do a lot of really complicated, inherently frustrating things, but they're also in many ways very lovable. And so I just want to live a life that tries to be of service.
Absolutely. Well, we can go on and on, Jordan. We can have conversations, for hours on end. But, I think we got a wonderful glimpse of the world, a theory of justice, a modern theory of justice in Jordan's
I don't know
eyes.
if it was that ambitious. But
We've learned a lot, and I think that this warrants future
Let's
conversations.
do it.
Perhaps, as you've continued to make the impact and the positive, positive, worldview that you want to impart on both yourself, on others, here in this community, in your home community, wherever that may be. But I'm excited for our next conversation.
Thank you. And thank you again for having me today. This has been awesome. Just time flew by. I can't even believe
An hour plus.
how quickly this went by. It's been really cool. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.